This is just the beginning.
Welcome to the News Shapers Juneteenth virtual event. I'm Russell Contreras, the race and justice reporter at Axios, and I'm coming at you from Rio Rancho, New Mexico. Thank you to Bank of America for making this conversation possible on commemorating Juneteenth. And welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Axios.com. Join the conversation today on Twitter with @Axios and use the hashtag #AxiosEvents. Over the next 30 minutes, I will be joined with my colleague, Naila Boodoo. We will unpack the historic significance of Juneteenth, the historic signing of legislation making Juneteenth a national holiday, and discuss Black political power in the U.S. Our first guest today is the representative from Texas' 18th Congressional District, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. Congresswoman Jackson Lee, thank you for joining us today.
What a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
After all these years, you've been pushing for a national holiday to recognize Juneteenth. What was it like sitting next to the president earlier this week and him finally signing a piece of legislation to do just that?
Well, it was an unthinkable moment. It was almost an unspeakable moment to be in that room and to hear the president say that of all the things that he may do in his tenure as president, he may be known for signing the historic Juneteenth Independence Day federal holiday. 12 years of work, 12 years of pressing forward, and to be able to see both a bipartisan unanimous consent in the Senate and an actual vote in the House of Representatives, 415 to 14. The day that we never thought would come. So many people have called from all over the country saying they'd never thought in their lifetime they would see the acknowledgement of slavery in America, a brutal period, by a federal holiday, 38 years after the last holiday that was Martin Luther King.
Now, I grew up in your district there near Acres Homes. What does this holiday mean to the people of Acres Homes and Freemanstown? This has been a holiday celebrated for years, if not decades, in the area of Houston and Galveston. But what does it mean now? One of their narrative histories is now a national holiday.
It absolutely means that they are affirmed, that all that they went through symbolically and in reality, because many are descendants of those who are in Galveston, who heard the words of General Granger that they were no longer slaves, they were free, and that they could live a life of employer and employee. Of course, there was a great migration of those slaves right out of Galveston to freedom. It also means that the stories, to Independence Heights, to Third Ward, and beyond, were the stories that now are part of America's history. It means freedom, and the way we define freedom is not just for one group of people, one group of the descendants of ex-slaves, but it really is America's story. It's Acres Home's story, it's Galveston's story, but it's America's story. And that's both the symbolism and the reality. But you know what? It is also a journey. It is a journey that we have now come to a place where we put a marker down. Juneteenth, after all these hundreds of years, is in fact a national holiday. But it says that we have work to do. And not that we should undermine what we just did, not that we should diminish it. We should not diminish this at all. And I hope people understand it is not easy to get a federal holiday. It took 30-some years for the King holiday, with protesting and singing and advocating. We steadfastly worked day after day for 12 years. And it says that you voted for this holiday. Now you can vote for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. You can fix the voting system to give us voting rights, to protect against those voter suppression laws. And you can give us that commission that will really study slavery and develop a repair pathway that deals with what happened and what is happening to those who, the descendants of enslaved Africans, the disparities that you find today in the Black community. We've done it. We voted on a question that dealt with the history of some people in America. And I believe that members will go home this weekend and they will receive the applause from those who believe that we're better when we're united. just like Abraham Lincoln said that a house divided cannot stand. We're united in that vote. We were united in the Senate. We're united in the House, and we understand what freedom is all about.
And what do you hope that becomes of this day, that it doesn't turn into like our other holidays where you can get a good deal on a mattress or buy a new truck? How would you like Americans to reflect on Juneteenth, and what should they be reflecting on?
Well, it'll be music to my ears when I'm hearing the Juneteenth holiday sale, or come out and get your sale of cars under Juneteenth. That means we've really made it. But I truly believe here's what we can do with Juneteenth. We often hear of these other holidays that are so important. I'm always elevating our fallen on Memorial Day, but we understand America. It brings people together, first of all, as families, as communities. I want to see communities coming together on Juneteenth. I want to see those who are quite different celebrating the Juneteenth parade on Juneteenth coming together. I'd like them to be celebrating big events in their big convention centers or their big arenas. But I want to take this opportunity as well for it to be a somber time of reflection, of a dastardly time in America's history. I want to be able to tell that little boy or girl that pulls your coattail and says, "What is Juneteenth?" I'd like you to be able to, as a dad or a mom, or as a family, as a church group or a religious organization, be able to say, here's the story. I'd like to see the reenacting of that period of General Granger so that people can understand the kinds of things that we have done in Texas or in Galveston, which will be done again this coming Saturday. I think we can do many things with this Juneteenth holiday. I think you will find in my heart, my spirit of hopefulness, that it is more unifying than you can ever imagine. And it is also the launching point for correcting the social ills, like improving our police community relationships, getting the voting system turned right side up, making sure we don't have that unfortunate situation of people being denied the right to vote. And what I've been working on for years with over 300 organizations, I think our Congress, our House can be a leader by voting on a commission established by the United States Congress to study slavery, to discuss, develop proposals for the disparities that are still going on today in the African American community. When you study this, you will lift the lives of Native Americans and many other groups that had their tragic circumstance, but none held in bondage for so long.
Congresswoman, if you could take me to a moment, if your mentor, Barbara Jordan, came back to Earth, came back from glory, and walked into your office and asked you, what happened this week with Juneteenth, what would you tell her?
Well, what I would say to her is that her life was reaffirmed. All the work that she did, the status that she brought to our community by her eloquence, her intellect, and her fight. First of all, Barbara Jordan provided the language as a member of the Judiciary Committee, which I am now a member of, to be able to include Texas in the Voting Rights Act. And I tell her this Juneteenth holiday, something that she celebrated from the time of her being a little girl or born in Houston, Texas, is now a national holiday. You count, the Honorable Barbara Jordan. You mean something. You're affirmed. Your life story, the history of those of which you have become the legacy of, you are now a national holiday. Congratulations. Juneteenth. Freedom is not free, but it is freedom, and it is for all of us. We can now tell our story, and we can tell it as an American story.
And Congresswoman Jackson Lee, thank you and congratulations.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. Good to see you again.
And next, we have a view from the top segment with my colleague, Vice President of Communications at Axios, Yolanda Brignoni.
Now joining us from Charlotte, North Carolina, Racial Equality and Economic Opportunity Executive at Bank of America, Ebony Thomas. Hi, Ebony.
Hi, Yolanda. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about Juneteenth. Juneteenth, of course, has been increasingly recognized, especially in the corporate community in recent years. How does Bank of America mark such an occasion?
Juneteenth is so critically important to who we are and where we're going. It gives context to history. And I think when we celebrate Juneteenth in the bank, it's a moment for us to reflect, to celebrate, but also to learn, to have courageous conversations, which we have encouraged our employees, all 200 plus thousand employees across the globe, to have those conversations, which is so important because it creates that environment where we can share each other's experiences. We have an opportunity to walk in each other's shoes and really understand, as I like to put, we bring our whole selves to work. And in those conversations, you really get to see the authentic part of who we are, what we live through in our communities, in our homes every single day. We get to have an opportunity to have that dialogue. And so that's just one of the ways, but we do it through engagement with our clients, with our employees, with our communities, and through events that we host internal to our employee base and our clients, but also just the recognition to our employees that we see you. This day is important. If there's time in which you want to take off and celebrate Juneteenth with your friends and family, that opportunity exists to you through an optional holiday. And so I think when we reflect back on the death of George Floyd over a year ago, and the fact that many individuals didn't even know that Juneteenth existed at that point, to get to now this really celebratory feeling and mood around what Juneteenth means, not only to our Black employees, but to all of our employees as American history and American experience is pretty thrilling and exciting to work for an organization that recognizes the importance of that holiday.
A little over a year ago, Bank of America announced a significant investment in advancing racial equality and economic opportunity. Can you tell us a little bit about that investment and what you're doing right now and what's coming?
Yes, great question, Yolanda. So June 2nd of last year, so just a little over a year, we made a commitment of $1 billion to racial equality and economic opportunity. It was not a direct reaction to the killing of George Floyd or that of Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor or the depth in which we were in at the time of the pandemic, but it certainly was a spark. I mean, a lot of the work that we had been doing in communities of color had been in existence for quite some time, but there was a moment of obligation that we met, a moment in which we recognized that we needed to serve our communities in a very different way, in a very open and honest way. And part of that was through the support of the $1 billion. And since that year, we've increased our $1 billion commitment to $1.25 billion as we look at a myriad of issues that continue to face us around racial equality, discrimination, and economic opportunity. And the four key pieces of that strategy is health, small business, jobs, and housing. It really speaks to the American dream, and that it is attainable for all, and particularly for communities of color, and how they are all intricately linked. That health outcomes is linked to people's ability to afford a home. It's linked to their ability to have a job and start a business. And those pieces are critically important. And the thread that we run through those four key pillars, housing, jobs, small business, and housing, is systemic issues, remembering and understanding historical context, how we got here and where we're going. I think those pieces are critically important. And so a demonstration of that 1.25 we find in our equity investment, dollars in which we have deployed to Black and Brown fund managers. Historically, they receive less than 1% of access to capital. And so the way that you overcome hurdles and you break barriers is to give these communities access to capital. But you also give them access to information. You break down walls of networks. You wrap services around them. So not only is it about the creation of the business, but it's also about the longevity and the survival of the business. It's also demonstrated in the work that we do with historically Black colleges and Hispanic serving institutions, as well as community colleges. We know that these institutions are foundational to the success of communities and communities of color. They are the pathways in which students walk through every single day, and it is their direct walk towards economic empowerment and wealth creation. And so the building of these institutions with the students sitting at the table, you have community leaders sitting at the table, and you have companies, which are the most important piece of this equation, sitting at the table to have conversations around what are the skills needed? What are the high demand jobs needed for success? And creating the pathways through these university partners, HBCUs, HSIs, and community colleges to provide those career pathways to those high paying jobs. So the 1.25 is really about change. It's about how do we bring solutions to the table, creative solutions, and really changing the paradigm about how we think about impact and who sits at the table and who's benefiting and who are the barriers that we're breaking down for. So it's truly exciting work. I'm passionate about it, but I'm passionate about doing it on behalf of an organization that really puts action into demonstration on a daily basis.
Well, speaking of action, we've talked a lot about what Bank of America is doing, and we've also talked about Juneteenth. In your role, what does Juneteenth really mean to you?
Well, I'm an HBCU grad. I graduated from North Carolina A&T. And when I left E&T, I started my career as an educator. I was a double major in English and history. And I moved to Texas, where I started to teach in a small town outside of Houston. And for me, 25 years ago, that was my first exposure to Juneteenth. It had never been taught to me. It had never been a part of my curriculum. And so it was the first opportunity that I really understood the term freedom. It's such a small word, but it's big. It was big to the enslaved. The notion that that none of the enslaved were free until they all were. And, trying to reimagine what the moment, what felt like, as that boat washed up against the shore to announce that, that they were free. It's phenomenal. And for me to be, part of the HBCU experience and not have that a part of who I am, I think it's so important. It's so important for companies to recognize it for their employees. I think it's critical for individual families to celebrate and understand. And I think it's important for the broader American community to understand the reason why Juneteenth is American history. It may be a reflection of the Black experience, but it's still American history. And it's critically important to who we are and who we are moving forward. So, personally, it's something that I've celebrated. I'm celebrating with my children. And I hope the traditions that we are now creating through Juneteenth will continue to be passed down to the next generation.
Well, I just want to thank you so much, Ebony, for joining us today and having this wonderful conversation about Juneteenth and what Bank of America is doing. And I want to thank Bank of America as well for sponsoring this event.
Thank you, Yolanda. Appreciate the time today.
And now to my colleague, Nyla.
Thanks, Yolanda. I'm Nyla Boodoo, host of the Axios Today podcast. Our final guest is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, most recently of On Juneteenth. She's also a professor at Harvard University, Annette Gordon-Reed, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
First, I have to start with, you were at the White House yesterday for the signing of this bill making Juneteenth a federal holiday. What was that moment like?
Well, it was a festive occasion. Everybody was happy. And it was a wonderful moment because I was wondering if Miss Opal Lee, who has been instrumental in making this day come to pass, would be able to make it there because all of this was very short notice. But she walked in and I was very happy and everybody was very happy to see her, including the president. So it was a wonderful occasion, just a good feeling. There were Republicans there were Democrats there were white people, there were Black people. and everybody was supporting this particular effort. So it was a good day.
I wonder if you could give us a little Texas history lesson, as is the goal behind your book, Juneteenth. You wrote that much of American history are moments where triumph and tragedy are inexorably intertwined. How do you think we miss that in the overall narrative when we look at Texas history today?
Because there's been an emphasis on triumphant and an emphasis on this idea that in order to be patriotic, in order to get young people particularly to have an affinity for and feel loyalty to their state or their country, that they have to be told nothing but positive stories about it, and that you should downplay the things in the past that are problematic. And I think that's why it is. I mean, it's difficult dealing with nuance, and difficult dealing with nuance when it involves circumstances that could be quite tragic. And people avoid that. People have avoided that. But we've been coming out of that over the past few decades. And I think has been a backlash against that idea of coming forward with all of the things that happened in the past, good and bad.
As a historian, I imagine you would say that you think that history constantly needs to be revised.
Absolutely. I mean, I hear people talk about revisionist history and revisionist historians as if they're out there making stuff up. But what happens is you find new material, and every generation has its own preoccupations, as they should. Every generation should have, its values and its aims and desires for the future and understandings. And so you change history. They look at the same material and ask different questions about it. And that's always going to happen. There's no way around that. Unless history's not a bedtime story that, if you have little kids, if you ever skip over anything, when you're telling them a story, they come back and say, that's not the way it is. But that's not what history is. History is about the past, and a determined and you'll never have total objectivity, but to try to see things as they were, to try to reconstitute that so that we can understand the past and maybe understand ourselves a little bit better. So we're always revising.
And when you think about the idea of sort of disentangling all of these threads critically, I wonder how you would like to see African Americans, Native peoples, Mexicans, those stories incorporated better into our overall understanding of the history of Texas.
Well, they should be incorporated because they are the history of Texas. I mean, if you think about, just trying to think of a metaphor here, an analogy, I should say, a movie where there are characters and they talk and there's nobody on the other end, and nothing happens, and they say things, there's no response, and they're responding to things that the audience can't hear. I mean, they were there. They were part of this. That's the interesting thing about Texas. It didn't have to become diverse. There's some states that over a number of time, different people moved in. In Texas, we start out with indigenous people, many different types of indigenous people. The Spanish are there mixing with the indigenous people sometimes and not. And then we have Anglo-Europeans coming. We have African American people. All of those people are there at the very beginning. And it's always been a very volatile place. And the diversity that we see in America now really began in Texas in lots of ways. It was always present in Texas, I should say. And that's what makes it, I think, something of a template for the United States of America because of its diversity.
What would that movie look like now if we were talking about an accurate depiction of Juneteenth?
Well, it would have everybody involved in it. And I think that's what's happening. That's one of the things that I saw yesterday was people of different political affiliations, people of different races embracing this story and seeing that it is an integral part of the American story. So that's what it would be. It would be Texas as Texas, but Texas as a part of the country as a whole. This is a union of states, and this is a very important union, the largest physical unit in the contiguous United States, a huge growing population, and a bellwether in some ways, in good ways and bad ways for the country. So you can look at this place and see the trends and see maybe where we're going, or alert us to places we don't want to go, all in this one place.
How are you hoping that all Americans will commemorate? As a historian, I wonder how you hope all Americans will be commemorating Juneteenth.
Well, I hope they will look at some history. I mean, I've said that this holiday is tailor-made for history because there's a story behind it, inevitably, and you have to begin to tell that story. And human beings love stories, and history is about different types of stories, whether you're talking about people or ideas or whatever, the story of things. And I hope that people will keep that in mind amid the celebrations, amid the red drink and the barbecue and all of this. There's a very important story behind this. And most of the Juneteenth efforts I have seen by institutions or organizations have some educational component to it. And I hope that continues.
And what's your response to people who are so upset that they feel like the narrative of this country is changing or that it's not an accurate depiction of what has happened?
Well, I can't, there's nothing I can do about that except to continue to tell the stories that I think are important and to read the stories of other historians and family stories. That's been one of the great things about doing this book is how it reminds me that we all have a history. And you could tell the story of your state, your area, through your family. We could all do that. So there's nothing I could say to people except to reiterate the fact that I'm acting in good faith. I'm thinking most historians who are writing in these areas are acting in good faith. They're not making stuff up. If I say that slavery was integral to the Republic of Texas, I can pull out the Texas Constitution, the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, and there are provisions that explicitly deal with slavery and promote slavery and protect slavery. There are provisions that say that African American people can't be citizens of Texas, and a provision that says that they can't come to the state and reside. Free Blacks can't come to the state and reside without permission. Those are racial questions, and they're questions about slavery. We didn't make that up. That's not a matter of interpretation. It's right there in the documents. And people act as if talking about race and racial problems are things that we just sort of made up in the last 10 years or so to be politically correct, that phrase. But in the 18th and the 19th century, people talked about race all the time. They talked about slavery all the time. It's in their documents. It's in the Constitution, as I said, and in their laws. This was a subject to grapple with even then. And they didn't grapple with it very often in ways that were not what we wanted, that we would want today. But this is not a new topic. Race has been at the center of the American inquiry. And other things happened as well. And I talk about other things. I'm a scholar of the early American Republic. I talk about the politics. I talk about Hamilton and Jefferson going after each other, about the report on manufacturers. I do all kinds of things that are not just about race or slavery, but those issues were at the core, at the core of the American experiment. From the beginning of the American experiment, but from before then, actually. So we have to talk about it.
Annette Gordon-Reed, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We so appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Now, back to my colleague, Russ Contreras.
Thank you, Nyla. Our final guest today is Dimitri Shabazz. She is the secretary of the board of directors of Amherst Media, and she's coming at us from Massachusetts. Dr. Shabazz, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, it's my pleasure to be here with you.
Before we get into the legislation that President Biden signed earlier this week to make Juneteenth a national holiday, talk to me a little bit about what this holiday means to the people of Galveston, Texas. You're a product of Galveston. This is where the event originated and has been celebrated for decades. What was it like in Galveston before we all knew about Juneteenth?
Oh, wow. I think about when I was growing up and celebrating Juneteenth, and you'll have to forgive me. All I can remember is food, pretty much, barbecue. And the reason being is that was a day in which we celebrated as a community. We had community picnics. Kempner Park actually was the place in which we had community picnics, and families and friends would set up pretty early. They would grab their spot, and we just all celebrated together, and the kids all played together. There were events that were going on in churches and at community centers, mainly organized by, the Black elders who were part of the churches, particularly Reverend Thomas in Galveston, who was a really prominent figure and leader. He and his son, Coach Thomas, would organize the parade. And so the parade would go down, I believe it was Market Street. And, he, meaning Coach Thomas, would actually recruit anyone who was in a band. We had one major public high school, Ball High School, and there was also the middle school, and the kids would be recruited. The African American kids would be recruited if you played an instrument to march in the band. It's just a really fun time. We also had Miss Juneteenth, and Miss Juneteenth was like the high point. Folks competing for Miss Juneteenth and that type of thing. It was just a really festive time. It was a time of community. It was a time of, being together and celebrating our history. They also went to Old Central. Old Central was actually the old African American or colored high school then. It had, become a middle school. They didn't get rid of the school. It was a middle school, but basically they'd go back. Folks who graduated from Old Central High would go back and have different celebrations, concerts, tributes, that type of thing. So, celebrating the history of Galveston was just wonderful. It's also a beach. Galveston's an island, and I think some people forget that. So we also had like celebrations there on the beach. People would picnic or go to the beach also at that time.
Now, Galveston, of course, was the site where enslaved people found out about emancipation months after Lincoln had declared in the Emancipation Proclamation. Did your elders tell you when you were younger about the deeper meaning of Juneteenth, or was it understood? What kind of stories did they share?
Absolutely. It was both, in the sense that we understood the history connected to the site of Ashton Villa. Ashton Villa was the site in which General Granger made the announcement that the enslaved folks were now free. We knew that history in that very kind of cerebral, dry way, but as children, what we associated with Juneteenth was really community and having fun. But we were aware, of course, that that had taken place on June 19th and had attached it to that meaning. We did not, however, from my memory and recollection, and I actually had discussed this with some of my friends, we were never... We didn't go to Ashton Villa to make that connection on that day. I think it's changed now, but that was something that was never like that directly associated with Juneteenth. We knew that history, but the villa wasn't some place where you then went to, commemorate that moment. In other words, it's like it was very separate. Black people had, their celebrations at Old Central High. They had their celebrations at Kempner Park and at their churches, but we didn't go to Ashton Villa. It was a historical kind of relic to us in many ways.
Now, over the years, Juneteenth has expanded nationally. You saw commemorations as far as Minnesota, parts on the East Coast. Last year, the day turned in some kind of mished with the George Floyd protest, and became something else. Now that we have a national holiday, what does this day mean to you, and what should it mean to us?
Ooh. I think I'll start with what it should mean to us. It should mean to us as a nation that this is a moment of reckoning and a moment in which we can all say, it's about time that we're recognizing our emancipation. You have to understand historically, and this wasn't, again, something that we were taught in Texas history books, but the soldiers, had to come and make this proclamation because these were Texas slave owners that some had left Alabama, Mississippi, all these other parts of the South to bring their slaves in order to keep their property. So this was something that took place in order to enforce the idea that the slaves are free because they were not going to do it otherwise. And I think we need to reckon with that history. We see the state of Texas, as well as other places in the nation, wanting to get rid of critical race theory. This is about teaching the truth. So it's about really reckoning with our past and commemorating that past, and then celebrating the possibilities of not only being African American, but what we can be as a nation.
In our final 30 seconds, Dr. Shabazz, did you ever think you'd see Juneteenth become a national holiday in your lifetime?
I was hopeful because I had gone to Colorado. I have traveled around the nation, and folks, when they find out I'm from Texas, it's like, hey, we celebrate Juneteenth. Also, our friends in Japan at the Japanese Black Studies Association, they recognize and celebrate Juneteenth. So I felt, hey, if it's crossed the waters in that way, eventually we are going to have this as a national holiday. But to have it now after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others that have been taken away, and after, Trump, this is just a wonderful, wonderful moment that we can all celebrate together.
Dr. Shabazz, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter faster. Thank you to our sponsor, Bank of America, for making this event possible. For more information, sign up for our newsletters. Visit axios.com/newsletters or go to our Axios app. Thank you for joining, and we will see you on axios.com.